studies through this gospel so far. On Sunday, Lord willing, we plan to pick up with Matthew, and so start walking through the text of Matthew. We'll spend the first class kind of looking at some overarching points made in Matthew and about how the document's structure. So that's our plan. Hopefully, if we can wrap up our thoughts here in Mark tonight. All right, it's 6:30. We'll probably have a few others joining us here as we go, but let's go ahead and get started for tonight if we can. Kevin, would you go ahead and lead us in prayer?
Yeah, let's say a prayer. Our Heavenly Father, thank you for being the God that you are, a holy and just God, yet also a God that has great loving kindness and great patience and mercy that you're willing to extend toward us, even though we don't deserve it. Help us, Lord, as we continue to walk through the Gospels, that we grow even deeper in our appreciation and our awe of your great plan to send Jesus. And as we look further into the events right before his crucifixion, help us to really appreciate it even more as we recently looked at how his will did not align with yours, yet he still chose to submit humbly to fulfill your great plan. And for that, we are eternally grateful. Please bless our evening and study. In Jesus we pray. Amen.
All right, thanks, Kevin. So if you weren't with us on Sunday, as we looked in chapter 14, we saw a lot of interaction between Jesus and his followers, his closest disciples in that chapter. A few other things that were noted, but a lot of what that chapter focuses on, or at least that section of Mark focuses on, is kind of Jesus's final teaching and messages to his disciples before he is to leave there. And so we left off just at the end of the chapter where Jesus has been arrested. And we see, and spent a ton of time on this, but we see here in this section that begins in verse 53 and continues through verse 65, where Jesus is in front of the council. We see this scene where they're trying to bring witnesses against them, and their testimony doesn't even agree. Mark says so that it's clear that they're bearing false witness. And as you look at the text, you look in verse 58, the question that seems to kind of gain some momentum, or at least some traction in this scene, at least as Mark records it, is this recollection of what Jesus had said about destroying the temple and this temple, and it's made with not made with hands, and in 3 days I'm going to build another. And so he points out that even that testimony didn't agree, but that seems to be the one particular thing that Mark interestingly calls out here. And it's just interesting to observe, of course, as you look at that question, that what Jesus is talking about in those statements is his own death and crucifixion and ultimate resurrection. And so they're somehow trying to use his statements about his own death as proof of the need to kill him. So there's just an interesting kind of play on how that goes out. Ultimately, though, we see in this account that in verse 61, the high priest ultimately asked, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Kind of cutting to the chase there. And the thing that I want to draw out in that verse, and we'll come back to in a little bit later, where he says, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" In the ESV, that phrasing, "the Son of the Blessed," isn't probably one that we see very often in the Gospels in reference to Jesus. We hear "Son of," but most of what we've seen in Mark is "Son of Man." Most of the references that Mark records and Jesus uses in this text or to the Son of Man. But if you remember back to the very beginning of the text, if you look all the way back to Mark 1:1, what Mark said at the very beginning is that this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And what we mentioned at the very beginning of that study was at that point that Mark just comes straight to is the point that he's proving, of course, throughout this document. And so it's interesting, this usage of the Son of the Blessed, is not exactly the same, but certainly the intention is the same. Even though he doesn't use the word God, he uses blessed. He's asking Jesus, are you this person? Are you the Son of God or the Son of the Blessed, as he puts it there? And Jesus, of course, affirms exactly that he is, and that he's going to see the Son of Man seated at power, coming with the clouds of heaven, which, as we mentioned before from chapter 13, is the language of judgment, the language of condemnation that they will soon see in time. And so the point being is, as Mark makes that initial direction about this is the gospel of the Son of God, we don't see that in quite those words come back up until we're right in the midst of this trial. And it's that question that becomes front and center again. Are you the Son of God? And Jesus says that he is, and we see clearly that it's that claim that he is crucified for the fact that he's the Son of God. And that's important in some ways because, it helps us appreciate that, Jesus wasn't crucified for reasons unrelated to his purpose or for reasons unrelated to his claim. He wasn't crucified because somebody told a lie about him or somebody told some truth about him. He was clearly and distinctly crucified and sacrificed because of his role, because of his relationship to God, where he was the Son of God, and the fact that people wouldn't accept that or the religious leaders wouldn't accept that. And so that phrase, the Son of God, we're going to see one more time in this text, of course, here in a little bit in chapter 15, is going to come back up again. And I don't want to put too much emphasis on that beyond what's intended, but it is sometimes interesting to know, as you read through these Gospels and read through these documents and pay particular attention to which phrase is used when. I think this helps us see that what Mark is still doing is tying back exactly to where he began and what he set out to show from the start. And so ultimately, Jesus makes this affirmation, I am the Christ, the Son of God, the Son of the Blessed. And it's for that he is very explicitly and specifically crucified because of that statement. And so we see that continue on. We see the scene with Peter and his denial as Jesus foretold, told him exactly what was going to happen. We see Peter breaks down and weeps when he hears about this. And as it's morning, he's delivered over to Pilate. And Mark doesn't record some of this scene that we see from other Gospels, of course. For example, we don't have, the record of Jesus being taken to Herod and some of what goes on back and forth there. But after he makes it clear that Jesus was crucified or Jesus was convicted by the chief priest because of his claim, pretty much the next thing we see is him being delivered over to Pilate for crucifixion. And so as he's delivered over there to Pilate, one of the things that I want you to know in verse 2, what is the question that Pilate asks? Are you the king of the Jews, right? As you read that in there. And that phrase, the king of the Jews, is actually going to come up several times here in this one chapter. It kind of becomes the predominant phrase of or the defining phrase in some ways of what happens after this. The idea that he is the king of the Jews. And so Pilate asks this. Jesus, of course, says that you have said so. And Pilate again asks, are you not going to make a defense? But Jesus, we're told, makes no further answer. And so in verses 6 and following, we see this scene with Barabbas. And of course, what role does Barabbas play in Jesus's crucifixion? First of all, what's his background?
He's accused of insurrection and murder.
Yeah, but we're told that he's a murderer. He's committed murder. He's committed insurrection. And so he's in this rebel and he's in prison. And what's Pilate thinking in this scene? What's he try to do?
Brother Andrew,
Yeah, Rita.
he is attempting to have Jesus released.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, in Mark's account at least, when you read verse 8, it actually says that the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for him. We don't know their intention. We don't know if this was completely coincidental, but there's perhaps a possibility actually that the crowd's observing this scene and maybe they're asking, thinking about what's going on with Jesus. We don't know whether that's the case or not, but certainly Pilate senses the opportunity when this question comes up and asks, "Do you want me to release for you?" And how does he refer to Jesus again? The King of the Jews, right? Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews? And so, whether he's saying that in a mocking way or not, he's making some kind of point in referring to Jesus in this way. And what does Pilate understand in verse 10?
That the motives for the capture and the activities going on with Jesus are not the proper motives, that they're really for very specific reasons by way of the individuals who are there gathered. The King James Version says envy, but there may be other words, I'm sure, that are there.
Yeah, exactly. And I want you, I don't want to stretch it too much, but to think just a little bit to back all the way going to the garden. And you kind of think of this scene in the garden where Adam and Eve are tempted by Satan. And what was Satan's claim that tempted Adam and Eve?
You'll be like the gods. You'll know what they know.
Yeah, God's holding you back and he's trying to keep you down. And so he appeals to their pride, he appeals to their desire to be elevated and tempts them with that. And you see, in many ways, kind of a similar thing being called out here. Pilate recognizes that they're envious of the position that Jesus has and the role that he has and the influence that he has. And he recognizes that. And so they're about to do this deed, again, based on their pride and their envy, rather than any legitimate reason. And Pilate, this Roman ruler not connected with all these affairs, can see that on the surface of the situation. And so it's then that we're told in verse 11 that the chief priests stir up the crowd. Again, whether or not they ask Pilate for this release or not, now the chief priests are stirring up the crowd when they sense what's going on. They sense what perhaps Pilate is trying to do and open the door here. And so ultimately, of course, the chief priests stir them up to have Barabbas released. And the result then is he turns and says, "Well, what should I do to this man you call the King of the Jews?" And again, it's interesting just to note that phrasing. Like, does Pilate recognize that the people have actually been treating him like the king? Has he heard the news? Has he heard what's going on in his city over the last few days? And so maybe it's meant in a mocking way, or maybe it's meant to refer to the situation that, hey, a lot of these people just a few days ago actually treated this one as the king. And so, again, we don't know and don't want to draw too much from that, but it's just interesting to think of perhaps some different perspectives from which Pilate may have been acting and saying some of these things. But of course, the crowd's been stirred up, and so they ask for Jesus to be crucified. And the thing, it didn't hit me for a long time about this situation, but this individual account about Barabbas really started to impact me a little bit more a couple years ago, maybe, because you look at this and in one sense you read the situation and you think, how messed up could this be that they would ask for Jesus instead of Barabbas, or that they would ask for Barabbas instead of Jesus to be released. And certainly there's a lot of truth to be considered just in thinking about that. But in many respects, and we'll see this through the rest of Mark's record of this scene for the rest of the day, but what we're seeing is very literally a picture of Jesus taking the place of a condemned criminal and murderer, right? what was supposed to happen in this scene, what should have happened, what justice would have demanded in this scene, is that Jesus would have been released and Barabbas would have been kept in prison and executed or punished for his crimes. But literally, what we see in this scene is that the guilty, the convicted, the murderer, the insurrectionist walks, and Jesus takes the place in confinement that should have been for that murderer. And so, it didn't strike me until, like I said, just a couple of years ago, that that's literally what's playing out in this scene. Is Jesus is literally taking the place of Barabbas here, literally taking the place of the guilty, the place of the one who's been condemned, and the one who's been condemned is walking free. And not that that says anything about the spiritual state of Barabbas or anything like that, but just to appreciate this scene. And I think Mark actually helps draw this out perhaps a little bit more than maybe one or two of the other gospels, because then the rest of this scene, what some of what Mark is doing is drawing out and emphasizing, and not that the others don't, but really emphasizing this picture of Jesus as the criminal, Jesus as taking the place of the criminal, and having a criminal's death for this condemnation. And so it really, once I started to appreciate, that picture of Jesus taking Barabbas's place and Barabbas walking free, it just gave me another visual to think about when I consider, the larger picture of what Jesus is doing in this scene. Let me pause there. Other observations or questions with that?
Andrew,
Yeah, Josh?
Josh. So in what you just described, would you in any way maybe connect and or compare this to in the Old Testament, the scapegoat?
Yeah, so there's definitely some echoes of that, right? In some shadows of that. Maybe not exactly a perfect corollary, but certainly
Right.
in that scene, but definitely there's some pictures of that that relate to what we see here as the scene plays out with Jesus.
And then one other statement, it's amazing how much we see that the chief priests really influenced the people. So they were considered the Jewish leaders, and they influenced them to really do what they wanted done. And the people probably think they're moving on their own, that they are getting what they want, but they really have been influenced by the leaders.
Yeah, exactly. And as we said, it's hard for us sometimes to reconcile the scene that we see here as Jesus walks into the city and what's going on now. And part of that may just become, this is probably, though there's a crowd, it's not necessarily the same crowd or as large a crowd as what you see earlier on. And again, some of these questions and statements in here do, if you look through them carefully, may also wonder, was the crowd just really always worked up against Jesus? Or as you mentioned, is it really a largely a function, or at least in large part a function of the influence that the chief priest and the elders and the scribes are having in this scene? But of course, we also see how the disciples themselves struggled, as we talked about in class on Sunday, going from this, I'm going to die with you, Jesus, even to the point of attacking the servant of the high priest, who, when they see Jesus, not resisting this and not opposing it, how it impacted even them. And so perhaps that's also impacting the crowd as well here.
Drew,
Yeah.
I just think it's interesting how, like you just mentioned, I was going to say how they were so, that we're so with you, Jesus. And I mean, I know that there's a lot of prophecy being fulfilled here, but I feel like that same type of situation happens today, with us, like throughout time. The Christians or the Jews were like, we're with you, God. And then, the the world just veers us right off into, oh no, let's follow that. Oh no, let's follow that, and I mean, just to reappreciate how much Jesus was focused on his task. I mean, he was a deity, but yet he had all that fleshly burden, weighing him down, the distractions of being human, and to still be so focused on the task. I'm so envious of that, to be able to focus on what the real point of life is, I mean, and so many people didn't get that. I mean, his closest followers didn't even stick with him, you know, and that getting wrapped up in the crowd thing. I mean, I think we see that right now, you know, people are just like, let's get our torches and let's go, you know, and I mean, that's just one of those constant struggles that I feel like we have, you know, and to see that pictured right here, you know, of course there's some prophecy in there too, but I don't know.
Yeah, in some ways it's harder to exercise restraint than it is to actively resist and oppose. And there, I don't want to say that a blanket way, but definitely there's cases where it's harder to exercise restraint, like you see Jesus doing here, right? And you know, there's different times, different situations call for different responses, but yeah, Jesus is steadfast. He's exactly following what he has said has happened. He's steadfast and committed to his purpose. And you see whether it's the crowd around him, whether it's his disciples, whether it's this other Roman ruler getting just caught up in the scene, right? And losing that focus, losing that direction.
Yeah.
And ultimately everybody in this scene ends up making the wrong choices, right? Except for one. Except Jesus, who stands here as this picture of meekness in the face of challenges, picture of strength under control, because he knows that this is what's necessary to fulfill the purpose that God has for him. Other observations?
I'll just throw in an observation. I think it's interesting how often Jesus is, or I would say, people other than Jews are exemplified or shown to have more faith or more understanding in who Jesus was than all Jews and even his disciples, like the Samaritan and these foreigners would get it. And here Pilate, he's not necessarily having a faith in Jesus, yet he understands what's going on in the motives. And it's just interesting to see how that all plays out to help us and help them see what's going on.
Yeah, we could talk a lot about labels, right? And the labels that we put on people, and then what we infer from people from those labels. And that is still as much of a caution for us today as it was in this situation back then. Those that we think should know and understand and respond a certain way because of the label that we associate with them, sometimes, maybe even very often, show a better, poorer understanding, I should say, than those that perhaps we wouldn't associate that label with. And so, yeah, it's not based on necessarily the ways that we assume people would respond based on their background and their exposure and knowledge, but oftentimes there's a lot to be said for the personal insight that one can bring to a situation. So as the scene progresses, we see, of course, Jesus being mocked, and you see in verse 16, again, this phrase, King of the Jews, being drawn out multiple times in this scene. And I just emphasize that to say, as we see through this scene, there's this keenly aspect to this whole scene. We talked early on, as we said, described what was going to happen. We described this as Jesus's coronation. Right. And you see that not just in a subtle way, but in very explicit ways. This is the King of the Jews, right? Referred to that. And when we look at the actual crucifixion scene, and you skip down or move down into verses 21 through 32, when Jesus is actually crucified, Mark notes for us that this inscription of the charge, he says in verse 26, against him read the King of the Jews. And, if many are probably familiar with this already just from past lessons and comments, but, the purpose of crucifixion, the primary purpose of crucifixion was to deter others from engaging in crime. And so, the Roman and other governments use this to be that deterrence, to do in this very visible way, this is what would happen to you if you broke the rules of the empire. And so to make it clear what people were being crucified for, it was common to put a sign on the top of the cross that put the charge against them. This person robbed, this person murdered. And so when Pilate prescribes that this sign be put on top of Jesus, what's the only charge that can be levied against him? He's King of the Jews, right? And so this sign, while some interpret it as mocking, and it may be in some ways mocking, I also see a significance to it from that kind of other context and aspect that you're going to crucify someone for a crime, and to deter people from others from committing that crime, you levy the charge against them. And the charge that's made against Jesus, the charge that is made against this Son of God, is that he's the King of the Jews. And so the sign is not incorrect, right? The sign's actually accurate, the charge that's made against him. And the irony of the scene is, as we know, if we bring to this an understanding of all the scripture before it, the charge is accurate and the sentence is necessary for the one who would be the King of the Jews, right? The one who would fulfill the promises to David and beyond, to reign in his throne, to reign on his throne, to be this king, this kingly picture, to be the head of the kingdom. The sign is accurate and the sentence is actually necessary for what it is. And so this attempt to mock Jesus and make fun of him, in fact, provides this really poignant summation on all that has happened and leaves no doubt that Jesus was in fact crucified because he was the King of the Jews. That was his only reason for his crucifixion, and the only charge that would be brought against him. And when you think about that perspective of trying to deter others from doing the same thing, there's even an element of it in that to us, I think, that only Jesus, only the Son of God would actually be willing to endure this and commit to this for the people that are actually carrying it out against them. And so, it's a powerful thing. I said, I'm not doubting in any way that maybe there's some element of mocking to the sign itself. Certainly others are mocking him and calling him the King of the Jews. But as you think about this scene, you think about the cross, you think about the inscription and all that's led up to this, like I said, it's a coronation, and the sign is accurate and the sentence is necessary for the one who would truly be the King of the Jews. And so as he's up there, Mark mentions and again draws our attention to the fact that he's crucified with two robbers there in verse 27, one on his left and right. So he's in there in this scene of a criminal. He's taken the place of the guilty, as we would describe it. And they're standing there and mocking him. And again, this statement about that he's made about the temple and tearing down the temple and those things, the people have heard it, right? The people have understood what Jesus had said, or at least that he was strongly saying this. And so they're mocking him about that and telling him to save himself. But what have they missed, even in the statement that they used to mock him? When did Jesus say the rebuilding would happen?
In 3 days, he would rebuild it.
3 days. So even the mocking that the people have exposes their own ignorance, not just because they don't understand that he was speaking about him, right? But he clearly and plainly said, that the temple would be torn down, but then rebuilt in 3 days. And obviously they misunderstood his reference, probably still assuming that he's thinking about the physical structure. But even in that moment, right, he had never proclaimed that he would save himself from this thing. And so, you see the chief priests and the others continue the mocking, making reference to his claims again that he's the King of Israel and the Christ. They clearly understand that he's claiming to be the Christ. And they say, come down for this that we may see and believe. But what they've missed is that that's not the confirmation of who he is. Not that he would bring himself down from the cross, but that he would give himself fully to the cross and yet still rise again. So they've missed that. And so as we see the rest of this text, that I don't want to skip over too much, but also want to be mindful of our time. Actually, let me pause there. Any other observations or comments through this?
Drew, I have a question.
Yeah.
when do they start referring to him as the King of the Jews? Like, is that something that Pilate starts? I don't know when do they start that before this point? Like, has he been referred to that before this point?
Yeah, we see in some of the other gospels some earlier references to that. Certainly Herod's interest is picked based on
Okay.
this idea of him as the king. You know,
Okay.
so where we see the record of
Right.
Herod, that kind of draws out, and then of course, you know, even in earlier discussions, there's this question of who he is and how that comes up, and not that people would necessarily understand it, but at least in this scene, it's not started with Pilate, but he does continue on what has been.
It seems like there's a, can you still hear me?
Yeah.
It seems like there's a difference between like the Jews and the Gentiles, like when they say he's the king of the Jews, and yet the Gentiles, like you said earlier, aren't the ones that are, you know, raising the ruckus, but the Jews are, you know, because they're personally offended by that, you know, that he would say that he is their king, you know.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Andrew,
Yeah, Eric.
one thing I'd say in reference to that is Pilate's job was to keep the Jews satisfied and down. It was a federal offense, if you will, if there's such a thing back then, to you know, challenge the kingship of you know, of Herod or whoever was king back then, and so what Pilate was supposed to squash any attempt, because the Jews are right now at you know, a bubbling teapot, so to speak. And as was mentioned before, there had been previous attempts to, you know, mount an offensive and basically restore the kingdom by force. And that's kind of what Pilate is. His job is, you know, on one hand, he has to keep them satisfied, allow them to, you know, exercise some religious freedom. But on the other hand, you know, he did interrogate Jesus to see if this was a legit, let's just say, resurrection. I mean, you know, trying to overthrow, you know, trying to free the a revolution, I guess, trying to free the Jews from the Roman rule. And when Pilate interviewed him, he just didn't see it. I mean, you know, you know, he didn't have an army. You know, Jesus was not warlike. I mean, it's all sorts of things. And as far as some of the statements Jesus made, you know, I don't know how anyone could even understand that. It's never happened before. I mean, Old Testament, you know, different places. If you're looking for it, you can find it. I mean, we have the advantage today of hindsight. So it was an easy charge to bring, really, because Jesus did make the statement. And a lot of the Jews who were there, you know, they weren't there when Jesus made the statement per se. They come from all over the world, and they came to see the spectacle. Everyone had heard of Jesus. They want to see what this man's all about. And so as far as him being the king of the Jews, you know, by the standards and understanding of the world at the time, that is kind of laughable, because no one understood the spiritual nature of it. And not even Peter understood that. I mean, Peter thought this was going to be by force, and he took his sword out, and, you know, he was ready to fight. So it's a thought paradigm issue, really. I mean, Peter and none of the apostles were ready for it. And if they weren't ready for it, I don't know how we would think anyone else would be. Those who believe Jesus just followed blindly by faith, because he's Jesus. They knew he was a special man. But it's not like anyone could understand it logically, say, to the extent that we do today now. That understanding would come later as Jesus would return and the apostles would, you know, further explain and teach the people. That's my understanding of it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the fullness of understanding, right, is still to come on the parts of these people. But at the same time, we see even here in these next few verses, right, that there's a difference in some people, right? Those who are overtaken by their envy and the crowd and other things, and how they act. And then we see several examples here in just a few verses, right? We see the centurion, this Roman centurion who sees these things and makes what proclamation? Verse 39, he sees these things and without knowing exactly what it is that impressed him, he looks and he says, truly this man was the Son of God. And that claim there, in terms of Mark's narrative, as we mentioned already, should take us back to immediately the beginning of this text and what Mark was set out to show and say. And he uses the centurion, this person, to affirm what is said about Jesus, not again with a complete understanding of what that means, but to acknowledge that there's something about this man for him to say truly he was the Son of God. And some will say that interpretation of the language isn't exactly right, and that maybe it should be read the Son of a God. But in either case, depending on how you understand that, he recognizes a deity aspect to Jesus in some way, shape, or form in this situation as he's observed Jesus' crucifixion. So he can see that. He's not blinded by the passions that are stirred up right now. And then we see, the Mary and Mary Magdalene and others who are there watching, while they've fled in the moment, they're there with him now and they're looking on. And then we see Joseph of Arimathea, who's a member of the council, but we're told that he's been looking for the kingdom of God in verse 33, or 43, excuse me. And so all these things go to show us, in the midst of this chaotic scene that just seems unconscionable at the time, there's still people who are genuinely impressed in the situation and moved by that, and recognize even in the midst of this who he was, and that there's something special, even if they didn't recognize fully the significance of all of that. And so as we look at chapter 16 then, as I mentioned at the end of class on Sunday afternoon, I almost said morning, but it was afternoon, right? So we look at the end of class mentioned on the end of class on Sunday. The verses in chapter 16 that appear after chapter 8, there's some question whether Mark actually originally wrote those verses. They were in the copies of the Bible that existed at the time that the Bible was translated to English and became widely adopted. But a couple hundred years after that happened, some earlier copies of the Bible were found that didn't have these verses that appear after verse 8. And so, there's some question as to whether or not, Mark actually wrote these words. Were they, lost and then found? Did someone else come along and add these words at the end? Clearly as we look through those verses, nothing that's contained in them is actually different or added to what we can find from other records in Scripture. So there's nothing that should give us concern or alarm in terms of what they teach and whether there's any confusion with the narrative about Jesus. But the interesting thing to think about is if you look at these 8 verses here, and if Mark actually intended to stop at verse 8, what kind of point is he leaving with the end of his readers? And so let's read these 8 verses again. Or together and think about that for a minute. Starting in verse 1 of chapter 16. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. And they were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And so if in fact, and again, we don't know for certain, but if in fact Mark actually intended to end with these 8 verses, what kind of lingering thought or moment does this scene kind of leave with us?
I'll thanks, Oliver. It's kind of like a cliffhanger. You want to know, okay, well, what happens, and it confirms everything that Jesus said was going to happen. But I think it leads me to wonder, okay, well, what's next?
Yeah, exactly. You look at this text and it's basically, this is not the end of the story, right? And sometimes that's what we want is, well, where's the end of the story? But in many ways, if it's intentional, it leaves you with the impression that, okay, this isn't the end. This just continues on, because he makes reference to the fact that Jesus has told his disciples before that he's going before. See if the echo happens again. All right. So let me try one thing here. Okay, see if that fixed it. All right, so yeah, as you leave this scene, if Mark's intentionally ending here, again, in some cases we say, well, why didn't he confirm the resurrection, or why did he maybe not give more detail than that? And if these other verses are added, then clearly he does that. But if not, then it just leaves you with this sense of anticipation, right? Of what's more to come. He's said these things, he's fulfilled these things, whether it's in relation to his death, whether it's in relation to his resurrection, to the fact that he's going to meet the disciples. We've seen and noted as we've gone through this text how Jesus, even moment by moment or day by day, says this is what's going to happen. And then you turn around and you see that happen. You see that thing come to fruition. So if Mark in fact intended to end here, it leaves you with that sense of this story continues and thrusts forward and goes on beyond this and doesn't end here. And so, while in some senses, like I said, we may look at this and feel like it's leaving us hanging, it's perhaps not intended to leave us hanging, but intend us to recognize that what Jesus started, what John said or Mark said at the very beginning, was happening, has happened, and continues to happen as you go forward. Other observations or comments on that?
Hey, Andrew, I wonder if this is if it is intended to end at verse 8, how much similar this might be to the end of 2nd Chronicles, where you have just kind of seemingly a bleak ending to the nations of Judah and Israel. And then it ends with, to fulfill prophecy, here comes Cyrus. And kind of just ends right there of this glimmer of hope. And so I just kind of see some of that similarities here at the end of Mark.
Yeah, it's a good comparison, possible connection in how those two are written.
I'll just throw another thing in the mix in terms of the verse 9 on. There is something I was reading, I think it was in the How We Got the Bible by Lightfoot, I think it is.
Mm-hmm.
He mentions an early manuscript that has the end of Mark, and it does not include verses 9 on, but it left space at the end of the document to possibly go back and include that. And it's just interesting that this question has been a question for a very long time. I can't remember the date of that manuscript, but it was pretty early.
You say something?
Right. Yeah, there's some that have the verses, there's some that have a space, there's some that actually have some other text in there to help it bridge. And so it is an interesting question, kind of a mystery, a whodunit kind of mystery in some respects. Again, don't want it to cause anybody to question anything. It's the very fact that we can see these things and know these things and cross-reference them that actually gives us assurances of the things that we can have confidence in. But it is an interesting question here of how Mark intended to end this. Rita, did you have
Hey, Andrew. Yeah, I have I think an observation. In verses 7 and 8, to me, what is interesting is the fact that the young man addresses certain people, specifically Mary. And when he talks about the disciples, he says the disciples and Peter, as if to emphasize those two things. and I don't know, I think it makes me stop to and think, if this were the end of it, just to verse 8, how interesting it would be that everybody, whoever they are, scatter, but in 9, Jesus appears to just one of them as opposed to all of them. So I don't know, to me that's interesting.
Right. Yeah, and certainly, seeing that it's Mary and the other Mary that are here at the end of this scene that Jesus chooses to appear to. We've talked about the role, and even though Mark doesn't call her out, it would be interesting if Mark had, but this scene where she's anointing him before his death with the oils and the perfumes, and to see that connection and to recognize, as we mentioned, a couple classes ago, the significance that she put on Jesus and the devotion that she had to him in this situation, to go even to this point of in his death, caring for him. And again, we go to the point of, well, she didn't understand, right? They're shocked by this. Everybody's shocked by this. Everybody that's heard Jesus say that he's going to be raised again doesn't seem to expect it. But yet there was still a commitment to him even after his death on the part of these individuals. They didn't look at this as, oh, this is the end of the things. He must have been wrong. He must have been a fraud. He must have been a fake. They didn't act in that way. They act still with a commitment and devotion to him. And you see that drawn out here as in this example of them going to anoint him.
Andrew, I know there's a lot of different views put out in the so-called Christian world where these scriptures should have been added or not. I know from reading in the past, from what I can remember, was the fact that all the ancient manuscripts did have this in it, except for 2, which were talked about as some of the earliest ones. And also, I remember there was a book written towards the end of that 2nd century, I think somewhere around 170, 200 AD, by a certain gentleman called Irenaeus. And he wrote in a book, he was addressing against the Gnostic heresies going on at that time. He wrote a book which was called Against Heresies. And he quoted Mark 16:19, that particular verse. So it seems like at least it was around then, perhaps before. It seems like there was someone else, but I can't quite remember who his name was. I want to say Eusebius, but I don't think that's who it was. But anyway, that's what I can remember.
Right. Yeah, definitely a lot of questions there to investigate. And like we said, at the end of the day, whether the text is there or not, the message doesn't ultimately change. And so, of course, we want to keep that in focus as we go through this. And so,
a lot consistent with the other gospels, really, with what was going on in those verses.
Right. Yep. So on Sunday, Lord willing, I want to spend some time reflecting back on Mark before we start our kind of dive into Matthew. So we'll spend a few minutes of that on Sunday. What I'd like you to think about is, as you have read through this document, how would you describe, how would you summarize, how would you explain the way in which a follower of Christ is to live? Like, what things, going from this document in particular, impress you about the example and the model that they laid out for a follower of Christ, and what that's going to mean for them? And so just be thinking about how you might summarize and describe that. Not looking for, real depth exposés or anything like that, but if you were to talk to someone about Mark and say, this is what Mark impresses upon me, if they ask you questions about this, what would you say to that question? And think about that, and we'll take some time on Sunday to share some of these thoughts before we move on into Matthew. So that's the end of our time together. We'll jump over to the link to hear the announcements, and hope you have a good evening.